Okay, yeah.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. To those of you online, those of you picking this up in catch-up video later. We're now 1 o'clock in the UK. We are pretty much halfway through the Marine Surveying International Fest second edition for commercial ship surveyors. And it gives me very great pleasure to introduce you to Peregrine Storrs-Fox, who is Risk Management Director for the TT Club. He'll give you a full introduction, but we had the pleasure of hearing Peregrine speak at our London conference earlier this year, and I think the content of his presentation was really relevant, and I was keen that he should come back and reprise this for you today, which he's gladly agreed to do. So without further ado, over to you, Peregrine.
Thank you very much, Mike, for the introduction. And yes, I'm Peregrine Storrs-Fox, Risk Management Director at TT Club, and I've actually been at TT Club for 35 years now. I had a legal background, came in and handled claims for the first half of my career, and then in the early noughties took over in terms of loss prevention and risk management services to our membership, so obviously drawing on claims and legal experience. And in that role now have had a lot of interactions with different types of entities across the industry to try to build collaboration and interest areas with regard to safety and security in particular across the industry. So I'm delighted today to be talking to you about cargo integrity and how that might interact with the world with regard to inspections and surveys. Just quickly, for those who don't know very much about TT Club, it's a niche provider of insurance throughout the supply chain, the freight supply chain. So we have an insurance product for cargo interests, freight forwarders and logistics operators, so those who are contracting to carry goods in all parts of the world, as well as truck and rail and land-based stuff, right the way through to ports and terminals. So they represent somewhere around 40% of our membership, and as it says on this slide, we're involved in ensuring different entities within 46% of the top 100 ports, which is quite a considerable profile. And also top right of there, you'll see that we're heavily involved in containerized insurance, unitized insurance, which of course is the history of the club 50 years ago that we were founded out of the internationalization of containers in the sort of mid to late 60s. Financially strong, and we underwrite in somewhere around 150 countries worldwide. So although we're niche, we do have quite a good footprint, we believe. And really at the outset today, I wanted to provide something of a profile, a picture of the sorts of things that I'm talking about here. Obviously, I'm only picking up some relatively small or few examples, but they're kind of things that we see as an insurer, which also means that as a broader industry, there's an awful lot more that is being seen, and as surveyors, you'll be aware of many of these sorts of incidents. So as the first one, here's a rail or a derailment of a container train. I don't know actually the precise cause of this, but I've been involved in incidents historically which have involved either point loading of particularly heavy cargoes such as steel coils going through the bottom of the container, or indeed that the rail car can jump points because of poor load distribution of even very light loads. And there was an incident in the UK a number of years ago which was fully investigated by the rail board, which was identified a cargo of less than a ton, but had shifted in the container during its journey and was effectively corner to corner of the container, and that was sufficient for the train to derail as it went over the points. So we're not always talking of big cargoes or particularly nasty cargoes. We can be talking about just purely poor practice in the way that cargo has been loaded. Similarly, obviously, the experience on roads can be quite commonly to do with rollovers, and this not particularly good image I use because actually it demonstrates a case where it was established that the cargo distribution was the cause of this incident. It was a road accident in the US. This truck was drawing up at some traffic lights and rolled over, and actually rolled over on top of a police car, which isn't the brightest thing to do in most jurisdictions, and particularly in the US. So a bit of a nasty case, but it demonstrates that actually the way that cargo is packed, secured in a container can actually have a material impact. And obviously with all these sorts of incidents, we're talking about the potential for a variety of causes, and road traffic accidents obviously can be driver error or road conditions, all sorts of other things. But in this particular incident, it was shown to be to do with the cargo load distribution and securing. There's some other lively examples of what we see. Top left, you might wonder how a cargo like that gets in a container. Well, of course, you tip the container on the side, roll it in. You might also ask, is the driver safely out of that container now? But of course, that doesn't do any good to the container, probably writes it off because of the load that has been put on the sidewall and damaged it. But also you don't see any securing, and machinery inevitably will have hydraulic oil or other oils, so potential for dangerous goods and leakage and all the rest of it. Top right demonstrates another sort of poor practice in a number of ways. I certainly wouldn't want to mix a car with drums of chemicals, and loading or packing a car on top of drums isn't very good here. It's likely to cause damage to the drums. You can see the sort of poor attempt at holding that car in place. That's not going to do anything with regard to the types of dynamic movement in any mode of transport, let alone at sea. And then, of course, if you think about a car, you've got potential for fuel, oils again, but also ignition sources in terms of batteries. So you've got a nice cocktail that could go bang at any stage. Bottom left, you might say there's an attempt at some sort of blocking and bracing, securing, but not a particularly robust one. And it looks more like someone getting rid of their old pallets rather than trying to ensure that the cargo gets to the other end in good condition. And bottom right is another example where, not unusually, we're told this cargo is so heavy it's not going to move. Well, the dynamic forces involved in transport are such that the heaviest things can move, and actually, while their mass may be great, their weight in scientific terms becomes negligible. So these things do move, and unfortunately these are all real examples of the sorts of things that are seen in the industry. Another example here, we've got something where there's no attempt at packing, and you might wonder actually how heavy the cobbles or a container load of cobbles are actually going to be. It may well have been in excess of the container's payload capacity, and therefore also in excess of potentially road regulations or other regulations applying to weight. So these are things that we commonly see. Moving on to perhaps more dramatic things, and I don't think it will be news to anyone that 2019 has seen an uptick in the number of ship fires. But I use this to illustrate that actually ship fires aren't the only place where containers are tightly packed together, and what I would call the adjacency risk. So here we have a terminal. This particular one was an incident in Vancouver where a cargo went on fire in the stack in the container yard. And thankfully, the responders, shore-based responders, which of course is very different from crews trying to respond to fires on board a ship, thankfully they did boundary cooling, because if they had tried to put water directly on the cargo within the container, we might have had another mini Tianjin. So these things are real risks and all too frequent. Moving more specifically onto ship fires, and as I say, there have been rather too many of those this year. The historic trend has been roughly 1 every 2 months. So over a 20-year period, that's the frequency that we've seen of major ship fires. This particular one is the MSC Flaminia in July 2012. And there are a number of reasons why I want to bring this one up, but just to illustrate really the cost, the complexity, and the time involved. So 2012, the judgment actually was handed down in New York in September 2018, so 6 years after the incident, and the dispute still hasn't yet been finally resolved. So we're talking about long period between an incident and final resolution, and that's almost paling into insignificance when you think of the costs involved. The direct cost or the claim cost is for this incident in excess of $300 million, and a ship that is these days relatively small. She was or is 6,700 TEU or thereabouts, whereas obviously you'll be familiar with the fact that nowadays we've got tonnage approaching 24,000 and potentially going beyond that. So we have an aggregation of risk in other ships. But it's probably because of the judgment that I wanted to highlight this one, and I'll come back to it in a moment. So as a kind of brief pause around that, the home truths that I'd want to explain that the industry is seeing is, certainly as far as marine insurers are concerned, we're seeing somewhere around $500 million per year of avoidable losses arising out of poor cargo stowage. So looking at the cargo damage type claims that could be avoided. And the reality is that if that's the insured cost, the total economic cost to the industry broadly is somewhere between $6 and $10 billion per year of what I would describe as avoidable losses. So that's considerable and something that shouldn't be happening. And it shouldn't be happening because we do have codes and guidance in place that should help for people to do things correctly. And specifically, I'm talking of the CTU code. Looking at some of the sort of more major incidents and coming back specifically to the MSC Flaminia, and the judgment actually is not necessarily bedtime, well, maybe it is bedtime reading if you've got a problem with sleeping, but it is a long and detailed judgment that explains really a lot about what is happening in the industry, the way that things are done. And that's why I describe it as the current obfuscation. There are a number of elements within the supply chain industry that are working in a less than robust way, such that we see problems. So dangerous goods regulations are an ideal example for this. So the IMDG code has been in place, the International Maritime Dangerous Goods Code has been in place since 1965, but is really very, very complex. It was brought over from bulk shipping into containerized or unitized shipping, and therefore has some questions around its perfect fit, but also is highly complex and has a lot of loopholes and some of you will be familiar with special provisions, for example, where there are literally into hundreds of special provisions which are effectively subtext that allows shippers to say that their goods are not quite as dangerous as they might first appear, and therefore don't need to be declared in full in relation to the IMDG code, dangerous goods regulations, or indeed that the application of the regulations can be less stringent. That in itself, the special provisions demonstrates one of the issues, that many of them haven't been reviewed for the last 40 years. And I don't think it would take much imagination to recall how much has actually changed in the last 40 years in this industry, let alone any other industry. Moving quickly on to mismatching coding. There's a reality that in the industry, obviously, there are a number of different ways that cargo can be described. And we have two broad ways that I want to highlight here. One is the harmonized system coding, which is used for customs purposes, and therefore has a pretty encyclopedic reference for any type of commodity. And then you've got what's known as the globally harmonized system, which is slightly confusing, but it's the one in relation to dangerous goods, those cargoes that may well be more hazardous during transport and indeed during other elements of their use. There is no current matching between those codings. So for tax purposes, fiscal customs purposes, someone may say that they have cargo A, but there is nothing that says they then are obliged to call it the same cargo when they declare it to the transport operator. And just thinking of behavior, it might well be that someone is more honest to a tax official or a government official than they are to a contractor who is merely supplying a service. The judgment also draws out a number of elements with regard to the information flows, and one particular light-hearted or fairly light-hearted example really is around the interaction between the shipper, the forwarder, and the carrier in this incident. And what happened was that the shipper said, I want to carry this particular type of cargo, and that was conveyed through the freight forwarder to the carrier. And the carrier's response was, okay, when can you tell us the gross mass of this cargo? So they didn't engage whatsoever in the initial stages in this is dangerous goods and we need to have X, Y, Z. They merely wanted to know the gross mass. Now, obviously that relates to verified gross mass, which came in or ultimately came in July 2016 as mandatory. But it was an interesting example of the fact that there was a mismatch of perceptions. The cargo interest was saying, I've got a cargo that you might be interested in. And in terms of the booking, then the carrier first off wanted to know, when will you be able to tell me the mass? Now, obviously that has information that is relevant for stability, but stowage is a lot more than just stability, particularly when it comes to dangerous goods. And then we come to the sort of more knotty problem of undeclared and misdeclared, which is an issue that has come up regularly in recent months as being a major cause. And that probably loops back to some extent to the complexity of dangerous goods regulations. For something to be declared and classified as dangerous goods, then it will be have a whole range of extra costs and management time involved to ensure that the cargo is properly packaged, packed, secured, placarded, as well as declared. So a lot of people will lambast the shipping lines and say they shouldn't be charging surcharges in relation to dangerous goods, but that's just really the tip of the iceberg in terms of the overall cost and complexity of complying with dangerous goods regulations. And of course, if a carrier then, because of their own ship limitations, their own policies, or indeed the routing of the ship at the load port, transshipment port, or indeed destination port, there may be restrictions as to what can be carried and how it is carried. Because of that level of complexity and the additional data that has to be drawn together, it actually becomes quite easy for you to see that someone might well want to misdeclare or not declare. And if carrier A says, sorry, I can't carry that cargo, it doesn't mean that the transaction, the sale contract falls away. That cargo will still move because internationally someone in one country has said that they want it, and the other country said, I've got it and I'm selling it. Someone will move it, and therefore they will either tell lies or they'll go around until they find a carrier who is duped or willing to carry it. So we do see a lot of problems on that, and there are specific commodities that I could give as examples, but in the interest of moving things forward, I'll leave that until there might be questions later. So how can the industry improve practices? Well, inevitably there are a number of moving parts, if you'll forgive the pun, in the global supply chain, where everyone actually is wanting to act on trust, and trust requires truth, and for truth there does need to be a level of transparency. So these are different elements that I'd suggest are ways that the carriers and the other stakeholders on both sides can have greater confidence as to what is happening. So starting at the top, the know your customer. There are already quite a lot of due diligence guidance around in terms of how someone chooses a supplier, but equally the supplier needs to have confidence that the customer for whom they are working is who they say they are. They're going to do what they say they're going to do, and they're going to do it with a reasonable level of competence. So looping back to the previous slide, you'll be unsurprised to hear that that isn't always working in a very good way. And the way that due diligence is carried out, I think, can be improved quite dramatically. That can be strengthened or supported by cargo screening, which is using algorithms to try to identify potentially misdeclared or undeclared cargoes or other problems. And then that itself can lead into other activities, and we'll come back to that. There are tools around DG compliance, ensuring that cargo that is classified can be correctly packed, segregated, all the rest of it within the unit, let alone on board a ship. X-ray CT scanning is an interesting one because it's probably emerging technology, but again has a capability to support different activities and be a cross-reference, a double check as to what might be happening in a particular unit load. And that really all leads around, both the screening and the scanning leads around to inspections. There are both commercial inspections and government inspections carried on a regular basis, but too few. So out of 180 million moves or thereabouts per year, we're talking of less than 100,000 inspections, which is not very credible in terms of an audit process, and hasn't really demonstrated the rigor that's necessary. But it is something that comes directly back to the surveying community to say, actually, what can we do to improve the way that cargo is surveyed pre-incident to ensure that it's safe to be carried, and it's applying the sort of good practice principles that are available and historically have been available to ensure that cargo where it's packed by someone who may have no awareness, particularly of the maritime mode, and thinks a container actually looks robust because they can't bend it themselves, they need to understand that there are a lot of stresses and forces involved in transport, and therefore inspecting cargo can be an important element to improve the process here and stop incidents occurring. Internet of Things is an interesting one in terms of the capability potentially for cargo to be monitored on a regular basis. Obviously, there have been devices put within cargo stacks for quite some time, and increasingly we're seeing that being applied to containers themselves. At this stage, fairly low level in terms of rollout, but there is the potential that you could monitor a container not just from a security point of view, but in terms of things like humidity or shocks or temperature, and therefore provide a more real-time alert to something that might be going wrong. And closing this circle, we have the enforcement element, which I'd have to say at this stage I think is sadly lacking. We are obviously dependent on government agencies and a number of different agencies in different jurisdictions to show some level of interest, and for governments themselves to invest in an inspection type program. What is reported into IMO is lamentably low level and doesn't really provide information. It is now accepted at IMO, certainly, that the information doesn't assist them in identifying how regulations need to be worked through in future. Therefore, the engagement across different agencies, and nowadays we're talking about security agencies, as well as crime agencies and safety agencies, and potentially even into phytosanitary type risks, we're needing to see a much more holistic government approach to enforcement to support the other activities that are mostly down to the industry to do. So where does this all lead us? In terms of the way that a supply chain works, there are a number of direct stakeholders, and that won't be any surprise to anyone who's reasonably familiar with the freight supply chain. In terms of direct stakeholders, the one that perhaps isn't illustrated here is the CTU operator, the person who owns and or operates the unit, has an obligation obviously to ensure that the equipment is in good condition and is ready to be packed with cargo. But putting those direct stakeholders to one side, we also have a number of indirect stakeholders. And I sort of specify some of them here really as an illustration that the way that people do things in different parts of the world and in relation to different trades will be influenced quite heavily by what they perceive as the most pressing need. So, for example, in trade practices, the buyer-seller relationship will be influenced by what happens in that sale contract. So if it's free on board or CIF, people will potentially be contracting and considering their obligations in a very different way. I've already mentioned about fiscal elements, health, phytosanitary, security, crime. So all these drivers will have some influence on how people behave. Enforcement, I didn't mention about training, the fact that there are legal obligations to carry out certain elements of training and record it and make it available. That is not followed through and enforced. Then we've got the elements around insurance and surveying, which obviously gets it closer to the sort of audience to whom I'm addressing this at the moment. So each of us has an obligation potentially to be describing to the people with whom we're interacting what good practice looks like. That may be in terms of good practice documentation, so guidance around how to pack particular commodities. It may be just pointing first and foremost to something like the CTU code, which effectively is what this is all about. The CTU code was agreed through the IMO, UNACE and ILO in 2014. It isn't mandatory, but it does provide good industry guidance as to what should be going on in the supply chain and the different responsibilities and ways that people can be involved. In terms of technology, I've identified some of those. I'm sure that you will be familiar with others as to how to improve the transparency and the way that things work. But the driver, even for technologies, can be quite different and quite sporadic in terms of the application for different types of trades. So we have a very uneven playing field that is not particularly well controlled by any element, and we have problems in terms of the incidents that arise. And that's led certainly TT Club to look across the industry to partner with a number of others, and there are 4 other entities that specifically we're working with, but through them with a number of other associations, governments, UN agencies, and government enforcement agencies to try to bring about a culture change, recognizing that we're talking here of a freight supply chain that has hugely diverse, fragmented stakeholders, not just people from across different parts of the world, but also different trades, different commodities, different interest areas. And none of them are probably incurring sufficient loss in themselves to make much difference here. So we're trying to reconcile those different interests and work out how we can do things better. And that leads to the Cargo Integrity Fit for Freight campaign, which is looking fundamentally at trying to unpack, if you'll again excuse a pun, unpack the different elements concerned with any particular supply chain, and starting with particular high-risk commodities. So charcoal, for example, would be one where we've investigated at quite some length. Where's it being produced? Where does it go when it's produced there? And actually what sort of cross trades are involved, and how can it be controlled so that it doesn't go on fire, in particular, on board a ship. So as we undo those and try to understand the different levers, the different elements that are causing people to do things, then hopefully we can work out ways to improve those behaviors overall. And inevitably, we're talking about competence training and the awareness of what is good practice. So I've mentioned the CTU code, which isn't mandatory. The IMDG code is, and of course, most other modes of transport also have mandatory dangerous goods regulations. But by and large, there isn't something generally for packing purposes except the CTU code. And one element that is very clear in terms of dealing with a very diverse and unstructured industry that is packing cargo on a regular basis is that the people involved may have, well, as a root language, something totally different from any of the UN languages, the 5 UN languages, let alone English. And therefore, we're needing to help to produce material in a way that can be understood, broken down, and made relevant for a particular packer who is presented with the cargo of widgets, whatever it may be, and a particular CTU container. So in essence, we may be talking about being able to produce an app in time that enables a packer to say, I've got this container, this cargo, this is what's going to be happening, tell me how to do it. And then the app would return in a pictorial sense, this is what good practice looks like. And of course, to do that, either whether we're trying to create a greater awareness of what good practice looks like, or indeed train into particular ways of doing things, or provide apps, we definitely need to have engagement from the surveying community, because you are the ones who are going to be most involved when things go wrong, but also have a greater awareness of the different elements involved in the freight supply chain, the different cargoes that may be involved, the different processes. So really at the end of this is a call for engagement with this process, and an invitation for you to get in touch with me, and the details are on this slide and fully available. I'd love to be engaging with different people who have seen problems that would really benefit from breaking down and trying to work out what good practice could look like, and how to develop processes that inform and educate people so that the level of losses that we're seeing, and I'm not just talking of the major fires, because we have a host of lower losses and near misses, each of which is endangering life and the environment and obviously assets. So we're talking about major societal cost that is, to my mind, not acceptable, and therefore we need to have engagement across a wide community to try to tackle these problems. Mike, over to you again.
Thank you, Peregrine, and thank you very much indeed for your presentation. Does anybody want to ask any questions? I would like to just explore something a little further with you. We've touched a few times actually today on misdeclared cargoes, but particularly willfully misdeclared cargoes. And I think that does come back to a societal change in a way. How do we get through to these people who think it's okay to misdeclare a cargo that results in a major fire and leads to loss of life? I mean, this is horrendous stuff.
I guess for me, it's a sort of spectrum of, well, we could call it shades of grey. In any cargo declaration that is rightly categorised as misdeclaration or non-declaration, there will be a range of sort of causes of that. As I've identified, there are issues around the complexity of the dangerous goods. And even before you get to think about it as dangerous goods, a common shipper may think that their their powered devices that they are packing up are fine, they're safe, they don't present any danger. But of course, lithium ion is a dangerous cargo, and therefore they need to be considering how should it be packaged, how should it be declared. So there will be some level of ignorance. And that's one area that certainly needs to be tackled. And that's certainly an area where I'd hope that the surveying community will be able to assist with that in terms of engaging with shippers, helping them understand that. So there's the whole educational bit through to sort of errors, and inevitably, because we're humans, we do see errors. And of course, one of the issues to identify, probably in parentheses here, is that we have a number of instances where, in effect, people trust computers because whatever goes on in a computer should be right, and computers trust people. So although we may in the future be looking at automation and other information systems that will support activities, it's at no point avoids the need for human interaction that is really thinking about it. And as a sort of side word, the MSV Flaminia judgment demonstrated that in full. And then as we get into the darker shades of grey, we are getting into the criminal fraternity and people who are very deliberately misdeclaring things. And that's one of the reasons that as TT Club and others involved in the Cargo Integrity campaign, we've been interacting quite extensively with World Customs Organization and inter-security agencies and crime agencies to say, actually, what we see that impacts us on safety almost definitely is impacting you in terms of crime and right way through to full-on terrorism. Anything that is deliberately put in the supply chain is causing, that is deliberately put in the supply chain and misdeclared, is likely to be funding something. Now, it can obviously be limited to that particular criminal, but quite often there is a sort of dotted line that leads inexorably towards very serious threats to society.
It's fascinating stuff, but it is scary stuff as well. And can I ask one other, this is a bit more of a leading question maybe, Peregrine, before I let you go. This is really for people watching and people who will watch this on catch-up video later. When TT Club, when you look to appoint surveyors, what do you look for? What are the key aspects you're looking for?
We're always looking for the right sort of competence for the job as it's known at the time. And certainly one of the conversations we've had, Mike, has been around the sort of training programs you've been putting in place and how that can provide some level of assurance and comfort. And indeed, this comes back in the insurer's perspective to our own due diligence, because we need to be aware that someone who we're putting out on a job has competence in what they're being asked to look at, and therefore are going to look at it in a proper way, but also provide some elements of solutions and advice to help to avoid things in future. So something like the awareness of the CTU code goes alongside pure training around how to go about an inspection, how to look after the individual safety, let alone anything else, and into report writing and all the rest of it. All very important elements, but there are a whole range of competencies that we would look for. And while there are commonalities in many incidents, not all of them are the same. So we're not always going to the same person because we've used them and had a good experience there. It's actually, we are quite often looking for quite specific expertise and knowledge base. So it goes beyond a sort of simple competence into quite technical and detailed competencies as well.
Yeah, that's helpful. And you referred to the work that we've been doing, and we will be coming out next year to really push that on to the next level. I think, this industry remaining unregulated, I'm talking about the surveying industry, it is just troublesome. And we don't necessarily want to overburden it with red tape and regulation. But I would love to be able to come to the TT Club and say, these people are competent to do this job, and then it's over to you. You know, we're presenting you with a bunch of guys who we know have been assessed and peer reviewed and are competent. But then, as you say, we talked about specialisms actually. How many specialisms can one person have? I was talking to a surveyor the other day who assured me he had 20 specialisms. When I said to him, I don't believe you can have 20 specialisms, he thought about it and he said, actually, you're right. I've only actually got one specialism. I have knowledge in other areas, but I only have one specialism. So, you know, it's tricky stuff, isn't it? And brilliant. Peregrine, I don't think I have any other questions for you. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to see you online. I'm sure we'll be speaking early in the new year, and can I wish you and your colleagues and your family a happy Christmas?
Thank you very much, and to you and all the other listeners as well.
And thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for this opportunity.
I could ask you to stop your share, please, on the screen.